Okay. So we'll go for about half hour or so, 35 minutes.
Fine.
And what else? So do you play the drums?
Oh, I use them in therapy, and
Yeah.
I play a lot of instruments, all very poorly.
Uh-huh. Nice. All right. Well, that
But
sounds
right now I'm only playing keyboard, so
very cool. All right. You ready to do this?
sure.
All right. So I'll read your intro and then we'll just kind of dive in here.
Okay.
All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to be continuing this series on managing in the current outbreak with Pat Ogden. Pat, welcome once again.
Thank you, Guy. Pleasure
All right.
with you.
So Pat is a pioneer in somatic psychology and both founder and education director of Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute, an internationally recognized school specializing in somatic cognitive approaches for the treatment of PTSD and attachment disturbances. She's the co-founder of the Hakomi Institute, a clinician, consultant, international lecturer and trainer, and first author of Trauma and the Body, a Sensorimotor Approach to Psychotherapy. Her second book, Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Trauma and Attachment, is a practical guide to integrate sensorimotor psychotherapy into the treatment of trauma and attachment issues. All right, Pat. So let's start off here. How are you doing? I mean, just to set the context, we are right in the midst of COVID. Everyone's trying to manage, but so just want to see ask how you're doing.
Personally, how I'm doing? That's a big question. I think, like everybody, there's a lot of stress with this pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I'm feeling it too. I think I've really had to up my self-care in order to manage it, which means long hikes every day. But, I'm one of the fortunate people who lives close to the Rocky Mountains in Boulder, Colorado, so I can get out to the wilderness, and I find that very resourcing.
And when you say up your self-care, does that mean doing more hikes or more things? People are curious about what you do too.
For me, it means doing more hikes, playing more music, making sure that I don't read the news before bed, putting myself on a bit of a diet with the news and the media. It also means staying really connected with friends and family. So I have Zoom tea time, cocktail hour, meals. My stepdaughter and I even watch movies together over Zoom. So really trying to keep that social connection, because while we need physical distance, we're wired to connect. And I think for many of us, there's a lot of grief around not being able to connect.
Right.
With others.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So let's, if we can, start with kind of a broad perspective here. I'm interested in how you're perceiving this pandemic in a broad, general way, and then let's kind of dial it in to talk more about how maybe it's affecting individuals, or how you see it potentially impacting individuals and therapists and so forth, if we could start there. So what is your perception in terms of how it's impacting us globally?
Again, that's a pretty big question. And one of the things that I'm very aware of is, although many call this pandemic the great equalizer because it doesn't respect differences, anybody who contracts the virus, is deeply affected. However, I think it's also really exposed the inequities in our culture in the United States and also globally, because the people who are affected the most are marginalized populations who have increased stress anyway and have more comorbid conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure. due to a great part because of their marginalized status. So I'm very aware that there are those of us who are privileged, who have advantages. We have medical care. We can physically distance. When I'm not in danger of losing my home or my job, whereas many people, they aren't able to get distance because they live in crowded quarters. They're not able to get medical care. They're having to take out loans to get food for their family. So for them, it's a much bigger trauma than it is for some of us. So in that way, it's not equal at all. And I think that's one of the things I'm really aware of, and that I hope globally that this opportunity will be taken to address some of the systemic oppression and how we are not, it's a trauma for all of us, right? It's a global threat to our safety. However, it affects different populations very differently.
In terms of, a lot of people have talked about, well, as they do with all traumas in a sense, but this one in particular, yes, there are a lot of negative things going on with it and associations, but also opportunities. Where do you see this possibly or potentially being an opportunity for us?
It's opportunities on many levels. Like I just said, on a systemic level, I think that's the biggest opportunity. It's also for many an opportunity to slow down, let the nervous system settle, because there's a lot of time with no agenda, because most of us aren't going to work, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a real opportunity to appreciate populations that we don't usually appreciate. Like I'm thinking of even the people who deliver my food, in Instacart, the people who drive Uber, the medical personnel, of course, and the people who are servicing the hospitals and the facilities. I think that there's an opportunity there. There's appreciation being shown to folks who usually don't get appreciation. Any stress offers opportunities to become resilient. And I think that's also an opportunity. People are learning, hopefully, new ways of coping and drawing on old ways as well. People are learning new ways to stay connected, for example, new ways to regulate arousal and so forth. So those are opportunities.
And in terms of, getting more specific in how this is affecting the individual, and even more specifically, therapists and how they're working, what is your feeling on how this current outbreak is impacting individuals and how therapists can work with them in a sense?
One of the things I think about a lot is how to develop resilience, no matter where you fall, for example, on the privilege oppression spectrum. It's an opportunity for all of us to develop resilience, which means to learn to recognize signs of our own dysregulation, like when our arousal starts to rise up or when it starts to drop too low. And get out of that window of tolerance, to be able to recognize those signals inside of ourselves and then do something different. I think if there's one skill that I work with myself and also with others, is to recognize those signals. This is where a news diet comes in, like to pay attention to your body and recognize when you're watching the news, when you're starting to get panicky and anxious, when your heart rate is starting to go fast, or when you starting to feel numb and just deadened inside. And when you recognize those signs, then you can take some action, even if it's as simple as a breath. And this is effective for people who are dealing with incredible stress right now. I was talking to a colleague in New York who works with in an agency that works with people who are being threatened with loss of job, loss of home, etc. And we were talking about the importance of, for those people, noticing when your arousal goes up and, find something, a self-touch, getting grounded, some movement, something. And the reason that's so important outside of our own well-being is for our own immunity. We all need to strengthen our immune systems right now. And stress really weakens our immune system. And it's associated with more vulnerability to susceptibility to the virus and how it would affect us. So it's not just for psychological well-being, it's also for our physical well-being, that we learn how to find the resources that will help us regulate and therefore become more resilient.
It's interesting you mentioned that news diet. That's really the first thing that I did too, because when this first hit, I was so anxious. I mean, I'm kind of on the anxiety scale anyway, and I love just keeping up with the news. So here I am now, my wife's out working, and now I've got my two kids at home, 4 and 11, and working at home. And I was really going nuts, and I was like, I've got to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what I did. I stopped reading the news, and I just slowed down. And I said, I've got to do something to keep this together, because I've got my kids, so I can totally relate to that. But it's not always easy, right? It's not always easy to have that self-awareness during those times.
No, it's not at all. It's really a skill, I think, that all of us have to learn. And, regulation has everything to do with the body. That's where sensorimotor psychotherapy really comes in, to recognize the somatic signs of dysregulation in our physiology.
Well, let's talk more about that. Where sensorimotor psychotherapy, SPI, comes into play here. Can you break that down in SPI language of what you're recognizing, how you're paying attention, and so forth?
Well, we work with awareness and mindfulness to help our clients notice the sensation in the body and to try to catch the signs of their sensation, say, before it's overwhelming. Because you see, if we can, for example, say we're watching the news, or a friend of ours got COVID, and we start to feel our energy rise. We might feel our heart rate increase. We might feel shoulders go up. We might feel that held breath, right? And if we can notice those signs before it gets to a full-blown panic, we have a chance to intervene, to regulate our nervous system. And that's to bring our arousal back into that window of tolerance. And because dysregulation is a physiological phenomenon, not a cognitive phenomenon, some type of physical action, it's different for everybody. That's why we work individually, we work in groups too, and with couples to find out what helps you regulate. For some, it's self-touch, which can be really helpful right now, especially because many people are deprived of the usual physical contact that they might have. For others, it's a centering exercise. For others, it's grounding. For others, it's movement and dance, or going for a run or a walk. So we want to help people identify those signs and identify the resources that they can implement right away before their arousal gets too high.
So if you're looking at the arousal on a continuum, I could imagine where some people might say, well, I only see it or only feel it when it's at a 10, say. Yeah. What is it going to look like when it's at a 4 or a 5? And I know this is general, but can you give us an example of what that might look like for someone?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because that's what we want to help people recognize. And again, it's different for different people. So I might ask a client, when they're in a calm, more regulated state, to just begin to think of a trigger for themselves, whether it was watching the news or some other trigger that they have. And when they just start to think about it, what's the first thing that happens? And many will say, I can feel a little tension in my belly, for example, because it's those first signs that are so critical. Mm-hmm.
I was, as you were asking, going through that, I was doing it on myself, and I could feel it. I remember when we had wildfires here in California. I'm in Northern California, and the wildfires were just blowing all the smoke, and people had to keep their windows shut, and we had to wear masks, and it was almost claustrophobic.
Right.
And as you were going through that little exercise, I felt, as I started to think about it, I felt like this tightness, that little tinge. All right, guys, just quickly, I want to thank Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute for being a sponsor on this podcast. Do you struggle to help numb, disconnected clients who can't feel emotion or explore inner experience? Learn a comprehensive approach to conceptualize your client's concerns. As someone who's gone through the level 1 and level 2 trainings of sensorimotor psychotherapy training, I can really speak to the power of this training. For me, it was a game changer and is so inspiring. Sensorimotor psychotherapy uniquely includes the body in therapy as both a source of information and a target for intervention, because words are not enough. Go beyond theories and gain practical ways to open a new dimension for effective therapy. Visit Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute online today at sensorimotor.org. That's sensorimotor.org.
And you're saying something else really important, Guy, and that's that, we only have one nervous system, but we have lots and lots of traumatic events in our lives, whether it's the wildfires, the car accidents, the falls, the surgeries, the abuse, etc. So this pandemic will trigger habits of neurological, physiological responses inside of us that are kind of where we go under stress. So many people are finding that trauma that they thought was resolved is re-stimulated in their bodies, and sometimes even in their images and thoughts and memories. And that can be difficult. And, I want to acknowledge too that the other big challenge that therapists and clients are having right now is working remotely, working via Zoom. And in a body-centered approach, of course, it's challenging to take it online.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, people listening to this, therapists, a lot of therapists of all kinds listen to this podcast, and survivors as well. But in terms of those therapists, what would you say to them if they're interested in learning more about SPI and sensorimotor psychotherapy and working with the body in a sense? What would you say to them? Is it mandatory that someone who's interested in working with trauma learn how to work with the body?
Well, it is for me. I can't imagine working with trauma without addressing the body, because trauma first and foremost affects our body. I always think of, like, if you're falling down the steps, you're not thinking, okay, the railing's to my right, I better hurry up and grab the railing or else I'm going to tumble all the way down to the bottom. Your body reacts much faster instinctively than it possibly could going through your cortex and your thinking mind. So trauma is really stuck in a way in a dysregulated nervous system and a muscular system that's prepared for instinctive defensive responses like cry for help, fight, flight, freeze, faint, feign death, those kinds of responses. So I can't imagine trying to resolve it top down by talking about it. I can't imagine not working with the body. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there are people who have success working cognitively, because as they start to work in that way, it kind of has a trickle-down effect on the nervous system and on the instinctive subcortical brain. I think it's more efficient to work directly with the body and integrate the emotions and the cognition.
One of the things that has come up a lot is a lot of the different ways that people are managing during this time. There was a lot of talk initially, on social media about, well, we're going to have all this time alone, or we're going to be, sheltering in place. It's important to be efficient and proficient and learn a new hobby, learn a new skill. And I've also heard a lot of people talking about, now that we're spending all this time alone with ourselves, a lot comes up, and it's not always easy to, I'm with myself. More anxieties coming up, or other aspects of myself that maybe I prefer to hide by, going to the gym or doing X, Y, and Z. It's not always easy to be alone with ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts about that. One is we've lost a lot in this pandemic. We've lost our connection, like you say, the aloneness. We've lost the ability to just go out when we want, whether it's to a bar or a coffee shop, to be with people, to be with our loved ones. So that is a huge loss. And a lot of us are feeling lonely. And on the other hand, this pressure to be productive during this time kind of drives me nuts, because there's an implicit judgment in that, like, if you're not productive now when you have all this time, you don't have good discipline and it's your fault, and there's this blame. So and a lot of people are thinking, well, I should be learning a new language, I should be doing things, should be writing that book or whatever. And I would say the most important thing is compassion. This emphasis on productivity is a Western capitalist emphasis, and it can be really debilitating for some people right now. So there's no one answer for anybody. People respond to this very individually. Some might be very successful at learning that new language, and that's great. Mm-hmm. Other people might be beating themselves up because they're not able to do that, and that just adds more fuel to the trauma fire. So I think the biggest thing is to be gentle, to treat yourself kindly, to be aware of your responses and take the best care that you can of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I really hear that, and quite frankly, that was something that I found challenging to do. I thought, during this time, I'll, try to be productive, because when this is over, we're still going to have that cultural lens through which many of us are looking through, and through which many people are looking at us, and I think, as you're saying here, to have that compassion, for me, it's really holding that compassion and continuing on with that compassion, even when this is over. So I really appreciate you saying that it's going to be different. How we move through this is going to be different for each of us. Mm-hmm. But to have that compassion for how we're doing it is really important.
Yes, I think so. And I hope that compassion will extend beyond, the individual to almost like a felt sense realization that we are truly in this together, which means that the people who don't have even the luxury of having the time in the social isolation, the people who are still even working 2 and 3 jobs, because there are people doing that even in the pandemic, the single moms who have to go to work and have no one to care for their kids. I hope that we can extend the compassion to those less privileged, mm-hmm. and find a way to address the effects of systemic oppression on our country and on our world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good advice for everyone, but also for therapists, maybe who haven't yet, started studying Sensorimotor psychotherapy. And for those people who, haven't started studying sensorimotor psychotherapy, what are a couple of things that you might suggest to them as they're working with clients during this time? And even more specifically, as they're doing it, like we're talking here over Zoom or something?
Well, I would suggest that they go to our website, sensorimotorpsychotherapy.org, and click on the COVID resources. And there's a free webinar that has 2 parts on how to address working through the body via Zoom. The first part is with Bonnie Goldstein and myself, and then the second part I did alone, just to address some other issues. So there's a lot of information, and it doesn't cost anything. Aside from that, I feel like I'm kind of a broken record, because I feel like a body awareness for ourselves and our clients is really going to help us here. Mm-hmm. It'll help us keep that arousal in the window. So I would suggest maybe that therapists start to get curious about their own bodies and how they're holding this, and start to be aware of the triggers for their own arousal and their own physical responses. When do they get tight? And can they trace that to something specific where that started? Or can they be aware of their breath and notice when they're holding the breath or over breathing, starting to hyperventilate? If they can just start to notice those physical phenomena, that's the first step to empower us to be able to regulate. And I would also say, I was listening to Deb Dana, who works with Steve Porges, who's a good friend of mine, on the polyvagal theory, and she had a nice way of saying, if we look at a continuum where on the one hand there's that imperative to connect with others, and then on the other hand there's also a need for solitude and calmness and self-nourishment and care, and to start to notice when we're where we are in that continuum, and when we're going off of the solitude side into loneliness. And for me, again, it's physical. How do you notice that? Like, what do you do when you start to isolate and feel lonely? Do you start to pull in? And is there another action you could make? Could you reach out to a friend or over Zoom, for example? So I appreciated her description of that continuum.
What was her name again?
Deb Dana.
Deb Dana, okay. I'll have her linked up. I also have linked up that those COVID series at the SPI website. But just for the benefit of the therapist listening to this, it's interesting when I asked you what you might suggest or advise gently for those therapists who are working with clients now, your suggestion was to be mindful of themselves as therapists. It wasn't something that they were doing for their client in a sense, right? But to be aware of noticing and curious about how their body's responding to this situation in a sense. That to me is very interesting. And I love that whole topic because it really invites us therapists to really look at themselves first, right? And that's not always the easiest thing to do. No, but I think in my work anyway, there's a learning kind of from the inside out. Like if I become aware of my own body and the signals in my own body, I can much more easily help a client. If I don't have that awareness, it's just an exercise to try to help clients tune into their bodies. It has to come authentically from my own, using my own body as a laboratory. Yeah. That's, to me, what's so exciting about the body. I'm in my 70s and I'm still learning from my body constantly. It's such a rich source of information,
And from there, then I have that resonance with my clients, even on Zoom. We can have that somatic resonance from awareness of my own body.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Pat, it's been such a treat. I love talking to you. You exude this authenticity and gentleness and compassion. And I love having you on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Guy. It's been a pleasure, and all the best.
All right.
Stay safe, everybody.
Take care.
Okay, bye.